When Audi created the original Q7 back in 2005, it quickly gained a reputation for being the German family hauler, the German luxury minivan, if you will, because it was priced more like a BMW X5 or a Mercedes-Benz ML, but it was considerably larger and roomier on the inside, also bigger on the outside. Remember that at the time, the X7 and the GL did not exist, and even when those vehicles came on the scene, Audi decided to keep the Q7 priced more like an X5 or a GLE, even in its second generation. And that explains why this second generation Q7 has been on sale for so long. There's really no direct German competition. You have to step up in price to get the larger X7 or GL, but you could get one of these with more room on the inside for about the same price as an X5 or a GLE. It got a refresh back in 2020 and another refresh for 2024, so while we wait for a third generation Q7 to come on the scene, let's see how this stacks up against its most direct competition. And that direct competition wouldn't be coming from Germany, it would be coming from Japan in the Acura MDX. It's currently the best seller in this three-row segment, or the Volvo XC90, which has actually been on sale for quite some time as well. Exterior changes are relatively modest for 2024. The most noticeable is going to be the new headlight design, where we find angrier daytime running lights, matrix-style LED low beams, and laser high beams. Yes, I did say lasers. We also find all-weather lights integrated into this headlight module rather than having separate fog lights below. That allows Audi to have lots of extra cooling room because, of course, you can get the Q7, or I should say SQ7, with 500 horsepower if you want to, so cooling is definitely required, and there's a lot of room down there for those extra cooling ducts. The grille, it's relatively the same as before. We have the small Quattro badge there, and then a symmetrical setup here for the radar modules. Now in reality, the Q7 has only one radar module. It's this one over here on the driver's side. The one on the passenger side is actually a blank, so that way the front end looks symmetrical. By putting the radar module a little bit higher off the ground, it doesn't get damaged quite as easily as having it down below, and it has a slightly different perspective on the road. Audi chose not to give us one of those plastic covers over the Audi logo, so they preserve the front end look and they make it look symmetrical by having that double blank. I've always been partial to the design of the Q7. It reminds me of a supersized Audi A6 Avant, and personally I find that attractive. It's 199.3 inches long, making this about 1 inch longer than an Acura MDX, about 4.5 inches longer than the Volvo XC90, probably the two closest competitors in this segment. It is still a semi-segment smaller than the BMW X7 or the Mercedes-Benz GLS. The BMW is about 4 inches longer, the GLS is about 5 inches longer, and they're also taller than the Q7, so they are going to be roomier on the inside, especially in the cargo area or in the third row. But versus the BMW X5 or the Mercedes-Benz GLE, the Q7 is definitely roomier in the back, especially versus the Mercedes, where it does have a fairly small third row. Most X5s sold in the US are going to be two-row models, although the third row is still kicking around as an option, and that's part of why the X5 has a somewhat squarer back end than you might expect. It's definitely a bit squarer in the rear end than some of the alternatives from Europe. What gives the Q7 the sort of supersized station wagon vibe is the really long hood design, and it is indeed really, really long, as you can see. That's because of the design of the Audi Quattro all-wheel drive system. Whether you get the 4-cylinder, the V6, or the V8 engine, the entire engine is sitting in front of the front axle, and that gives this a fairly long front overhang. But it is still a rear power biased vehicle because it uses a rear-wheel drive ZF 8-speed automatic transmission with an integrated all-wheel drive system. And that also gives us a slightly longer dash-to-axle ratio than you'd find in, say, a Volvo XC90. The big difference between this and the XC90 really is going to be the hood length, because the XC90 has about the same kind of interior room. It just has a front end that was designed only for a small 4-cylinder engine to be sitting across the front end, and that allowed them to give it a much shorter hood. The LED taillights mimic the sort of multi-chevron theme going on in the DRLs up front, and we have the typical Audi progressive turn signal in the back. I've gotten a lot of questions about this. The way this works in the United States is that as far as the legislation is concerned, the top part that just flashes on and off, that's the actual turn signal. What's down here below is just sort of an accent light doing that sort of progressive vibe. If I open the hatch, you'll notice that the taillights move up with the hatch. This is a distinctive Audi feature, and that means we have to have repeaters down below. So this is where we're going to find the backup lights, auxiliary brake lights, and auxiliary turn signals as well. That's one of those legislative requirement things also. So if your lights move up and down with the hatch, then you have to have a secondary set down below. Down below that, we find the typical Audi imitation exhaust tips, although I find these a little bit more pleasing to my eye than the totally fake chrome-rimmed ones, because these are a bit more discreet, a bit better integrated with the bumper. The actual exhaust tips are actually tucked up under there. In the middle of everything, we find a hitch receiver because you can tow up to 7,700 pounds in the Q7. That's long been one of the reasons to get this over a GLE or an X5. You can get some of those BMW and Mercedes models with high tow ratings. However, the Q7 has an available adaptive air suspension that wasn't always available in the competition, and the longer wheelbase and the extra size of the Q7 just means it's a better tow vehicle. Now let's dive under the hood and talk about why the engine is entirely in front of the front axle. One of the most common misconceptions about Audi's classic Quattro layout is that it's front-wheel drive in nature. That is absolutely not true. This has more in common with the BMW X5 than an Acura MDX. And if this was front-wheel drive based, it simply wouldn't be able to have 500 horsepower in the SQ7, because no front-wheel drive transmission can handle that much power. In fact, the transmission in the Q7 and every classic Audi Quattro layout, from Audi A4 to A7, from Q5 all the way up to Q8, they actually have much more in common with the average BMW than the average Acura or Volvo. The key difference is in the transmission itself. So we have a regular ZF 8-speed automatic transmission behind the engine, but they put the transfer case and the front differential into the transmission case as well. And in the average all-wheel drive BMW, the transfer case and the front differential are separate. That allows the front differential in a BMW to actually be sort of underneath the engine, or sometimes in front of the engine itself, depending on the design. With this layout, because everything is jammed in the same case, the transmission has to end right about the front axle, since the drive shafts are actually coming out of the transmission unit itself, and that pushes the engine entirely in front, whether we're talking about the inline-4, the V6, or the V8. For 2024, there are still those three different engine choices: 261 horsepower out of a 2-liter turbo, 355 horsepower out of a 3-liter turbo, that's the one we're taking a look at today, and 500 horsepower if you get the optional 4-liter turbo V8 in the SQ7. I can't take the engine cover off here because it is unfortunately tied with these air intake ducts, so I would show you exactly how the layout works, but unfortunately I can't. Key thing to know is that the front axle is right about here, and the engine starts right about here, and that means that you do get a weight balance that is more similar to the MDX or XC90 because the engine is so far forward, but most of the power is actually going to the rear axle. Now, there are some variations in the Audi Quattro lineup that tweak this a little bit, because with this kind of layout design, it's actually kind of easy to disconnect the rear axle. So in some Audi Quattro systems, Quattro with Ultra, they will disconnect the rear axle and then they will run as a front-wheel drive vehicle. Also, there have been a few Audis where they completely remove the rear drive shaft, and it is a front-wheel drive layout with a rear-wheel drive transmission. That is kind of a funky setup there. So still have that longitudinal transmission. It's still a transfer case effectively at the end. They just delete the rear axle, and hey presto, you have a front-wheel drive Audi with a rear-wheel drive transmission. If you want to know more about that, I have a complete set of videos on that. I will let you take a deeper dive somewhere else. After a week in the Q7, I give these front seats 10 out of 10 points when it comes to our front seat comfort score. Volvo has long had a reputation for making very comfortable seats, but I think Audi actually beats them with the Q7 versus the XC90. I find the XC90 seats to be a little bit more attractive to my eye, but these seats are more comfortable for my body, which is probably the important part. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar support, an extending thigh cushion, inflatable side bolsters, and something you don't find in any XC90 for any price, a powered tilt telescopic steering column that's memory linked to that 2-position memory over there on the door. Jumping into the second row, we don't find quite as much legroom as you might imagine. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. I have only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of legroom left. That's because combined legroom in here is pretty similar to the XC90 or MDX, even though this is longer on the outside. Again, that's because of what we were talking about underneath the hood. However, the second row seats are very comfortable, and there's some unique features here. This is a 40-20-40 second row bench, and each of these sections slides forward and backward independently of one another. So if you do have kids in child seats, or say a child in a child seat, you could put that child in the center seat, scoot them further forward so that way they could be closer to their parents. This middle seat also has a fold-down center armrest. The shoulder belt comes out of the seat itself, not out of the ceiling, which really makes that child seat installation a little bit easier. And it has latch anchors in this center seat position as well. So we get 3 sets of latch anchors for the second row. You might be wondering what that thing that I popped out of the seat was. It's actually the cover for the latch anchors. It's a squishy cover, and it goes right there and snaps onto the latch anchors to hide them. This model has 4-zone automatic climate control, which is definitely a nice touch for the rear seat passengers, but as you can see, the driveline hump is fairly pronounced. Getting into the third row is pretty easy. This has a fairly traditional fold and tumble second row design. It's worth knowing, however, that you cannot leave a child seat latch anchored into place and still obviously fold this seat in that manner. The middle section here has a fairly similar fold design, but of course it doesn't tumble forward. I can, however, scoot it out of the way to show you the kind of legroom we find back here in the third row. Again, bear in mind the general dimensions of this. This is not the roomiest third row imaginable. I can, however, stick my feet under that second row, and I could probably survive back here if this second row middle section was slid a little bit further forward. As far as headroom goes, it's definitely limited back here. I certainly have to slouch in order to get my head back there to the head restraint, but I could sit back here for 20 or 30 minutes if I needed to, and there's certainly a way to adjust the first row and second row seats so that I could sit comfortably there, and I could sit in relative comfort back here in the third row. This seat is all the way back in its tracks. I could scoot it further forward if I could also scoot that other passenger seat further forward. One interesting touch back here in the third row is that we get latch anchors for both seating positions. So this is one of the very few vehicles in North America that has 5 sets of latch anchors. Thanks to the wide second row bench, I was able to install a rear-facing infant seat and one of the larger convertible child seats available in North America side by side right there on the outboard side and in the middle. You could even install 3 here if you really wanted to. Also worth noting, larger child seats like this do not interfere with the buckle for the outboard seating position. And again, it's really handy that you can scoot that middle seat forward and backward independently, so you can either give the kids a little bit more separation or you can bring that child a little bit closer to the action up front. With the passenger seat comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, you can see that there is still enough room to install one of the larger rear-facing child seats like this Kiko seat. This one is suitable for kids up to 65 pounds. And in case you're wondering, yes, if you have an infant seat with a load leg, you can actually use those in the center seat position with it all the way forward. There is just barely enough clearance going on. Behind the power hatch, we find about 25% more cargo room than we find in the Volvo, but about 25% less than we find in the Acura. Still, it's a pretty practical cargo area, and I suspect most folks are going to have these power folding third row seats folded most of the time to expand that cargo area out even further. One nice touch is that because this has an adaptive air suspension, you can also make the rear end of the vehicle kneel by pressing that little power button right over there, lower that down so that way you can improve the cargo load-in height. What's under the floor? Well, I'm glad you asked. Over here we have the tire iron, we have the can of Fix-A-Flat and tire inflator right over there, a 48-volt lithium-ion battery there, and then a subwoofer for the audio system in the middle. Going for a quick spin around the interior, we find the controls for the panoramic moonroof right up here, including the power shade and the power opening front pane. We then have a 4 sun visor setup in the front, so 2 sun visors for each side. This one goes over there to the side, that one folds down just right like that. That is kind of a handy thing if you're on winding roads, and this one also slides in and out. For the driver and front passenger, we have height adjustable shoulder belts and fixed headrests in this particular trim. The headrests are going to change based on the different versions of this vehicle that you get. This one has the S-line trim, so we get slightly different seats. Here's a better idea of how those seats are actually fitting in right there, those child seats in the back. You can see that there is definitely enough clearance between that infant seat and the seats up front as far as that middle position goes. As we see in a number of Audi's models, there are a bunch of different upholstery designs and even different seat designs available in the Q7, so if you aren't a fan of this particular look, there are others to choose from. One nice touch is that the extending thigh cushion with this particular seat design employs a bottom sort of roller where this portion of the seat actually kind of uncurls itself there, rather than a sliding section that has a place for all the crumbs to catch. I do like that. I think this is easier to clean. Moving over to the front doors, we have mostly soft touch materials in the front doors, including the entire lower section of the door. Really, the only hard plastics you'll find are the inside of that bottle holder. The interior materials definitely feel more premium than the ones that are in the Acura MDX, which is currently the best seller in this segment. definitely better than the current generation Lexus RX or the new Lexus GX. And that's to be expected, of course, because it's something that we've seen from Audi for quite some time. The interior definitely has a very horizontal and very restrained theme to it, but all the parts are really nicely done. Stitched upper section of the dashboard right there. My only complaint is the amount of shiny black plastic we find in this particular trim. Quattro logo there, and then we have the brushed metal on the dashboard instead of wood in this model. Pretty big bin and slot style glove compartment there. I had no problem fitting larger tablet computers inside. And then going back up to the top, you can see that the air vents are really well integrated into the theme of this interior. Moving over here to the infotainment system, I wasn't able to find a shutter speed on the camera that would keep this from looking like it's flickering, so sorry about that. As you can see, it supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, but that smartphone integration occupies just that portion of the screen, leaving this section of the screen available for direct access buttons. Audi's MMI system definitely used to be head of the pack, but for me, I think that the Mercedes and the BMW infotainment systems now feel a bit more modern, and I will say that navigating around the menus of this two-screen system are just a little bit convoluted sometimes. It's something that you'll get used to, and the appearance is definitely very solid. I love the design of it, but I do think that the menus could be just a little bit simpler. Down here we find the controls for the climate control system. Those are all touch controls. This one takes us to some other options right up there. You can also minimize that and get some infotainment options right there in the middle. And then you can use these controls for controlling the front and the rear climate control zones as well. So I can hit that option right there. Then this one turns into the rear climate control zone. That's part of the convoluted nature. I'm not quite clear why it's so many steps just to play with the rear climate control there, but it is definitely a few. We then have touch controls for the drive mode select over here, including in an individual mode, engine start-stop button for the 360-degree camera system, automated parking software, a shortcut button to some of the vehicle's driver assistance settings, and then you can adjust them there in that particular touchscreen. Then we have two big cup holders right over there with a place where you can dock your key, electric parking brake, joystick style shifter, big area where you can store your smartphone. If you sort of work it in right like that, then you can actually close that lid on your smartphone. The storage area under here is relatively small because remember again, this has a rear-wheel drive style transmission, even though it is all-wheel drive standard on this particular model. There's also a Qi wireless charging mat if you'd rather charge your phone underneath that armrest. On the driver's side, we find a full-color heads-up display, and a touch that I really appreciate is the fact that the material that covers this area is the same as that covers the rest of the dashboard. And in fact, I should mention that the entire upper section of the dashboard is also stitched, so you can see this area right over here, right around the defogger vent, and over here on the sides of the dashboard. This is all really elegantly done as well, and the seams all align really nicely. It gives us a much more cohesive and much more elegant feel than we find in the best sellers in this segment. And I actually think a little bit nicer than the Volvo XC90 as well. Over here we find a full color LCD instrument cluster. This of course features Audi's latest software, including a moving map display, so I can toggle over there to get the full LCD Google Maps. Now that does require a subscription to maintain that pretty look. If you don't have the subscription active, then it's going to be a relatively plain LCD. We also get lane information here with little car icons if we were on a freeway, so you could see what those other cars are doing out there on the road. The steering wheel, it is a distinctly Audi design. Perforated leather on the sides, unperforated leather on the top and on the bottom. This, of course, has the S package on it, the S-Line package, so we get that little badge there. Small paddles on the back of the steering wheel, down over here on the left, up over there on the right, and then controls for the infotainment system. Roller control for the volume, that's not my favorite right there, but we do get track forward, backward, voice command, favorite button, and then over here we have controls for that multifunction LCD cluster. The radar adaptive cruise control, that's controlled via this stalk over here. What I've always loved about the Q7 is that this is the kind of SUV that's very, very easy to live with. And in that respect, I would say actually a little bit more like the BMW X5 than something like the MDX or the Lexus RX or the Volvo XC90, because this, I think, is a little bit better rounded than some of those other options, with the only exception being fuel economy. There's no hybrid version of the Q7, no plug-in hybrid in this generation, and that is something that I would love to see. Aside from that one omission, I think everything else about the Q7 is nearly perfect. Acceleration from this 3-liter turbocharged V6 is definitely fantastic, 5.7 seconds in this model in our testing, and the braking distance was also exceptional, just 108 feet for this model, likely thanks to the wide 285 width tires we find on this particular Q7. Now, clearly, your 0 to 60 and your 60 to 0 stopping distances are going to change based on the engine you choose. If you get the base 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, I do think that that's not quite powerful enough for the Q7. It just comes across just a little bit too slow, a little bit too sluggish for my tastes. I don't think it fits the personality of this vehicle quite right. The 4-liter V8, on the other hand, it definitely fits the character nicely, and it's really going to give you a lot more power, but it's also going to give you more weight on the front axle, and that is something we should address here. For some reason, a lot of people think that, I don't know, the Q7 handles like some sort of crazy wallowy pig on the road. That is absolutely not true. The handling in this vehicle is sharp, and it is really, really well dialed in. As far as handling feels go, I like the way the Q7 feels more than the MDX or the XC90, certainly than the XC90. Although, interestingly enough, the XC90 actually has a better weight balance than the Q7, especially if you're looking at the plug-in hybrid models, because they shift a lot of weight towards the rear. However, weight balance is not everything, and that's something that I continually try and remind people. This has a strong rear power bias all the time, and that's not something that we find in an Acura MDX. Yes, the MDX with super handling all-wheel drive can send up to 70% of engine power towards the rear, but it's that up to part. And that up to is not going to be as long or under as many conditions as this vehicle can, just by the way this transmission and the all-wheel drive system is designed. Other things that are certainly going to affect the way the Q7 behaves on the road versus the competition are the adaptive air suspension that this model has, the 4-corner steering, and just the general design of the suspension as well, which I think is superior to what we find in the Acura MDX. Don't get me wrong, the MDX is great, and you are going to pay more for the extra polish we find in the Q7, but that's really what the Q7 is about. It's about that refinement, that level of polish, the easy to live with nature of this vehicle. And I really do like the 4-corner air suspension that we find here. It is tuned towards the softer side of things versus the Volvo XC90. That definitely has kind of an unusual tune to it, something that I've commented on before, but if I move this vehicle over to its dynamic setting, the damping definitely firms up, and this certainly feels more firm than the XC90 or the Acura MDX Type S with its adaptive air suspension. That shouldn't surprise too much, of course, because Audi's been at the adaptive suspension and the air suspension game longer than Acura and Volvo, so there should be more time to better polish systems like this. The other area where the Q7 is more polished is cabin noise. It's definitely quieter in here than either the Acura or the Volvo. The Volvo is particularly loud, actually, for a luxury segment vehicle, even though they've improved it over time. And one of the areas where a lot of folks have problems with the XC90 is engine noise. You certainly are going to get more of that 4-cylinder noise coming into the cabin, and the only engine offered is a 4-cylinder engine. So even though you will find quicker 0 to 60 times in the plug-in hybrid XC90 than this model, its engine is not going to feel as refined, and some people may just not like that. They may be willing to give up a little bit of acceleration time for the smoother notes of this V6 engine. And I should mention that that Volvo is not just a little bit faster, it is notably faster. It's a half-second faster than this Q7 model. That new 455 horsepower plug-in hybrid system from Volvo is wicked fast, but it's also a little bit unusual as far as its behavior, because you can get torque steer and oversteer at the same time. It puts a decent amount of torque to the rear axle thanks to that electric motor in the back, but it still has approximately 300 horsepower on the front axle, so it's not going to drive like the Q7 is. This certainly is going to feel more tail-happy if you really push it hard, but because we have that extra weight up front, it's never going to rotate quite around like something like a BMW X7. You're just going to get those solid rear power dynamics with the rear end pushing nicely and neatly in the corners. The extra weight makes this feel very predictable, and that is probably a good thing when we're talking about ostensibly a family SUV. The one area where I think the Q7 does need to improve is fuel economy, and that's likely to happen in the next generation of Q7. Rumor mill says that's probably going to get a plug-in hybrid system, and I would expect that to be more dynamic than the plug-in hybrid system we find in the Volvo. As it is in this model, we've been averaging 18.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. Given the size of this, I would say that's not bad, but if you are looking at an XC90, you'll get faster acceleration and you'll get significantly better fuel economy, about 9 miles per gallon better in that model. Bottom line, out on the road, the Q7 is incredibly well-rounded. We have solid acceleration and braking numbers, solid handling numbers, a quiet and comfortable cabin, ride quality that's not going to make people upset on longer road trips, and enough performance that you're certainly going to have a lot of fun when the kids aren't in the vehicle. I've mentioned this before, but generally speaking, I'm more impressed by a vehicle that is well-rounded and doesn't excel in any particular category, because designing this kind of vehicle is actually more difficult. If you want the fastest 0 to 60 time, you just put a more powerful engine under the hood, but you're going to give up different aspects of vehicle performance. Maybe it's going to be too loud, maybe it's not going to be comfortable, etc. You want a really comfortable cabin? Jam a really softly sprung air suspension on there, but handling is going to suffer. Instead, Audi really decided that they wanted to make an incredibly well-rounded vehicle with a usable third row, and that's exactly what they've done with the Q7. But perhaps more impressive than that is the price range on the Q7, so let's talk about that now. So how much is the German luxury minivan going to cost you, and why am I calling it a minivan? Well, it's the combination of spaciousness and, honestly, affordability that really give it that title. It's notably less expensive than a BMW X5, and even though it's a little bit more than a Mercedes-Benz GLE, it's bigger than both of them, and it's significantly less expensive than an X7 or a GLS, $23,000 to $28,000 less. Simply base price to base price. For 2025, the Q7 starts at $61,695, making it a pretty decent deal and actually putting it an awful lot closer to some of the other competitors that you might want to be cross-shopping it against, like the Lexus TX, depending on the version you're looking at, or of course the best sellers in this segment, which would have to be the Acura MDX and the Volvo XC90. Let's actually talk about just those two competitors here. The MDX is obviously less expensive, and of course it has a V6 standard, but it's one of the few naturally aspirated V6 engines. Basically all of the European options are going to have turbos. Some shoppers may gravitate towards V6 engines because they like the sound, or because they think they're going to be more dependable, more reliable, and less expensive to keep around long term. Some of that may be true, especially on the long-term maintenance and reliability costs. That's probably one thing to keep in mind, is that the MDX, generally speaking, is going to be less expensive to keep around than the Q7, but that doesn't necessarily make the MDX more fun than the Q7. Super handling all-wheel drive has always been an asset to the MDX, but remember, of course, it is optional in that model. And when they say 70% of power to the rear axle, they don't mean 70% of maximum engine power. Of course, if you want something that's decidedly fun, has a lot of standard equipment on it, and a fun turbocharged V6 engine, you can get that in the MDX Type S. I think that is a really good deal in this segment. Where the MDX really wins, of course, is price, reliability, maintenance costs, and a pretty roomy and accommodating interior. We have very similar kinds of legroom totals between these two vehicles, but we actually get a little bit more third row headroom and, importantly, more cargo room as well. Next up, we have the Volvo XC90. This is sort of the other European option, and Volvo has magically managed to claw their way up the sales chart to be the second best-selling luxury three-row in the US. I think that's pretty logical, actually, when you take a look at the XC90, because it looks beautiful on the outside, and good looks honestly sell. The other thing the XC90 does well is look good on the interior. The interior is really well done, and I would say better done, generally speaking, than the Q7. The technology in the XC90, some of it's feeling a little bit old. They've refreshed the infotainment system over time, but the software can still be a little bit sluggish. On the other hand, driving dynamics are a solid competitor to the Acura. We also have excellent fuel economy standard, and it has the bonkers 455 horsepower plug-in hybrid system. And this has logically been one of the reasons that Volvo has propelled themselves up the sales chart, because that's proving to be a very popular drivetrain option. Depending on where you are in the United States, it could account for over 50% of all of XC90 sales. And I think for good reason. You get nearly 30 miles of electric range, and when that's over, you get nearly 30 miles per gallon. It's an easy win-win. It's almost as efficient as the Lexus RX with a whole heap more power and, of course, the electric range. And it's a lot more available than the Lexus plug-in hybrids as well. On the downside, it's smaller on the inside than the MDX or the Q7. Legroom figures are still solid. We have about the same kind of room as the Q7, but about 4/10 of an inch less third row headroom, which is already below the MDX, and about 3 cubic feet less cargo capacity. So that is a reasonable amount of difference there. If you're looking to carry maybe 5 or 6 people occasionally with some of their cargo in the back, it's going to be a little bit more possible in the Q7. On the other hand, the lease deals on the XC90 have been pretty fantastic. The plug-in hybrid does start at $71,900. It's worth noting that the base version of the XC90 is less expensive than the Q7, but interestingly, when we're talking about leases, and remember that a majority of luxury vehicles are leased, you could actually lease a plug-in hybrid XC90 for about the same price as most of the lower end trims of Audi Q7. And that's a really tasty proposition. Instead of getting under 300 horsepower, you could get over 450 horsepower. Instead of getting around 22 or 23 miles per gallon, you could be getting 27 or 28 miles per gallon and some electric range as well. I think bottom lining the Q7 is that it's a really good deal. It's getting a little bit old at this point in time. We are expecting a complete redesign or at least a major refresh to happen soon. But at the moment, I think it's a reasonable proposition to get the Q7 over the competition if you're looking for a little bit of extra room and you just like the driving dynamics and of course the Audi logo as well. There's a reason it's the third best seller in the US. It's a really well-rounded option and a lot more affordable than the BMW or the Mercedes. You will find more room in the BMW X7 or the Mercedes-Benz GLS, but you're going to be paying over $20,000 more for not really that much more room and that much more practicality than the Q7. And if you're willing to pay 20 grand more, you know what? You could also buy yourself an SQ7, have a reasonable amount more fun than you'd find in the base versions of the X7 or the GLS, and it may still actually be less expensive than a comparably equipped BMW or Mercedes. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what would you cross-shop against the Q7 if you're shopping in this segment. Be sure and find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the other social places. I'll see all of you next week.